Korean nationalism. Self-strengthening movement in the late 19th century.
In the next section of the lecture, we're going to look at the March 1st movement, other independence movements, and how this helped with evolving and changing Korean nationalism.
What is a common reaction when you find yourself vulnerable? How do countries or nations react?
From the beginning of the colonial period, there were resistance movements to the Japanese. So, for example, there were what are called righteous armies, and these were small groups that would hide, and then they would come and they would attack the Japanese police or anyone related to the Japanese colonial structure. And they primarily engaged in kind of guerrilla tactics. But because the Japanese colonial police force was so powerful, many of these had to move outside of Korea and became based in Manchuria. We also know of the March 1st movement from a previous lecture, and that after the March 1st movement and its brutal suppression, that many independence movements then moved abroad. Let's first look at the March 1st movement, though, a little bit more carefully. So the March 1st movement, what the independence activists did was they declared that Korea was an independent nation. So again, it is about defining what the Korean nation is, and in this case, insisting that the Korean nation still exists. And the organizers of the March 1st movement, they sent petitions to foreign representatives. They also sent a message to President Wilson of the United States, and they declared this Declaration of Independence, and the movement spread across the country, which was a nonviolent movement. But because resistance also had to move outside of Korea after the March 1st movement, we see that these resistance movements, they start to take on a slightly different tinge. And primarily this is because as independence activists move to places like Manchuria, China, and Russia and are exposed to communist ideology, their nationalist sentiment is very much influenced by communism. Then we have the Shanghai Provisional Government, which was established after the March 1st movement. And again, this is a government to try to represent the Korean nation. So although the Korean nation did not formally exist and was not recognized by the international community, this is Korea's attempt to say to the world that yes, the Korean nation is still very much well and alive. And this government became dominated by US-based groups later on. Now, the March 1st movement itself was inspired by President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which he wrote about and spoke about after World War I at the Versailles Peace Conference. And in this declaration, he points to one key point, which is self-determination. So Wilson had in mind former colonies in Europe and wanted to ensure that these former colonies would be able to have independence based on the principle of self-determination. He wasn't referring to Korea, although the Koreans picked up on this and they decided to apply it to themselves. And they said, all right, well then we also have self-determination and should be independent and have our sovereignty restored. And this is one of the inspirations for the March 1st movement. But because of the empires that had existed in Europe, After World War I, as far as the Americans were concerned, it was in their interest to break up these empires and to ensure that these newly formed countries or nation states had sovereignty and that the sovereignty would not be infringed upon by other nations. As a result, there were organizations abroad that sent delegates to the Paris Peace Conference in order to make a case on the behalf of Korea. So they said, listen, we also are the victim of imperialism, and we should also have our independence restored. And there were many churches within Korea that also were mobilized for this effort. Unfortunately, none of these efforts were successful, and in fact, once delegates arrived at the Paris Peace Conference, they were not allowed entrance. And so because Ko Jung died in January of 1919 and a funeral was to be held, the organizers of the March 1st movement preempted this, and they decided to declare the independence of Korea on March 3rd by gathering in Seoul. So very much what we see is that the nationalist sentiment of this time was fueled by anti-Japanese sentiment and anti-imperialist sentiment. Now, in the Declaration of Independence, the authors wrote, "We herewith proclaim the independence of Korea and the liberty of the Korean people. We tell it to the world in witness of the equality of all nations, and we pass it on to our posterity as their inherent right. We make this proclamation having back of us 5,000 years of history and 20 million of a united, loyal people. We take this step to ensure to our children for all time to come personal liberty in accord with the awakening consciousness of this new era. This is the clear leading of God, the moving principle of the present age, the whole human race's just claim. It is something that cannot be stamped out or stifled or gagged or suppressed by any means." So here we have the Korean nation being defined by its 5,000 years of history, by its 20 million citizens, and it is because of this history and culture and the shared sense of nationhood that they are proclaiming their independence. So crowds had gathered, and there were coordinated events where the Declaration of Independence was read in other parts of the country, but this was brutally suppressed by the Japanese police and army, even though it was a peaceful demonstration. What is noteworthy, though, is how diverse the movement was, how widespread it was, because it took place throughout the country. Over 1 million Koreans participated, young, old, men, women from all different backgrounds and intellectual traditions. And this was really a unifying force and the first massive show of Korean nationalism. The Korean interim government, the provisional government, was set up. Unfortunately, this government was not really able to accomplish much. It certainly did not accomplish or achieve independence for Korea, and the political differences amongst the leaders became too great. But what we do see is that there are resistance groups outside of Korea and in the United States. So whereas resistance groups in Manchuria, China, and Russia were influenced by communist ideology, resistance groups in the United States, on the other hand, were influenced by American democratic ideals. Unfortunately, none of these movements were successful in restoring independence to Korea. What these movements did do, and what they were able to accomplish, was that they expanded the national movement throughout different parts of the world, expanded organizational activity abroad, and helped to develop further changes in policies in Korea. So the Japanese, because they were criticized for their brutal suppression of the March 1st movement, they then changed their tactics to cultural policy in Korea. But what we do see is throughout the colonial period is we see what is kind of a fractured nationalism, fractured Korean nationalism. And I describe it this way because of the very different types of ideologies that influenced different national groups. So that by the end of World War II and when Japan surrendered, there were those on the political right who were nationalists, but they had their own ideas of what the Korean nation should look like and what Korean nationalism was. And there were those on the political left who had also their own ideas, which were very different from what a newly formed Korean nation should look like and what their nationalism was. And it is this divide, the split, and the differences in ideology, which then has an effect on events in the post-liberation period, as well as the post-Korean War, and the reason why Korean nationalism has developed in different ways in the modern period.
These are the keywords for this class. The March 1st movement, Declaration of Independence, Provisional Government, Righteous Army,